On the research of the Doherty Institute, once 70 to 80% of people are double vaccinated in this country, we will start to open up.
To resume his seat, it being 2 p.m, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Solomon.
My question is to the Prime Minister. According to a report, Afghans with valid Australian visas who protected the Australian Embassy and their families, up to 1,200 people, were left to wait outside Kabul airport, some standing in sewerage, before being turned away. Is that report true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, what I can confirm is last night 950 people were evacuated from one of the most dangerous places on earth. They were done by the brave men and women serving in our Defence Forces, supported by our officers from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Home Affairs, dealing with one of the most difficult situations anyone in this place could imagine. 950 people in one night on 5 very dangerous flights. Some 2,650 people now, in the course of the last 22 flights, have now been evacuated from Kabul back to AMAB, and they are already returning home now to Australia, where so many of those Afghan nationals and their families who have served and supported Australians over many years, they join the 1,900 who have already come to Australia before this most recent series of events commenced, and they will make their home here, and they will become Australians, and they will be very, very welcome.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House how the national plan, backed by expert advice, will enable Australians to live with the virus and will help create a stronger nation on the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Stirling for his question. He'll particularly welcome the news that I've just conveyed to the House about just how many people we're managing to evacuate from Afghanistan, from Kabul at this present time, and I thank the member for his service. Mr Speaker, the national plan is the clear path Australia needs to live with the virus in the future. That is what we must do. We must face that future and we must live with the virus into the future. It is a plan that is for safe reopening. It's a safe plan, Mr Speaker, that focuses on protecting the most vulnerable throughout the many stages of that plan. It's a safe plan that parents can have confidence in, that employers can have confidence in, that workers can have confidence in, that communities can have confidence in, because it's evidence-based. It is an evidence-based scientific plan that is supported by the best medical advice but also the best economic advice, which says that when you get to 70% and 80% of your population over the age of 16, Mr Speaker, that is vaccinated, then you can, Mr Speaker, live without the lockdowns into the future. And that is what is so incredibly important. Now, Mr Speaker, it's an honest plan because it understands and acknowledges that once we get into phase B and indeed into phase C, there will be additional cases. And we will be living with COVID within our communities, and we will be doing it safely, and we'll be working with states and territories to ensure that our public health systems, Mr Speaker, are there and able to support the community in the same way. Mr Speaker, that they do that with all other infectious diseases. Mr Speaker, it's a necessary plan because it means children will be able to go back to school, Mr Speaker. It's a necessary plan because it means businesses will be able to plan for their future. It will ensure that Australians will be able to get those hours back and go back to work. It means that our tourism and travel sectors will be able to get back onto their feet in our aviation sector, and not just domestic, but international as well. It means that artists will be able to go back on the stage and perform at live venues. It means that agricultural producers will be able to get the workers they need to ensure that they can provide the food, Mr Speaker, and fibre that our country needs and that we export to the rest of the world. It means that universities and colleges will be able to welcome those students back and they'll be able to return to our country. Mr Speaker, it's a plan that ensures that financiers and investors in Australia can have confidence and they can be reassured and reinforced, Mr Speaker, in our credit rating will be able to be reinforced as well. Mr Speaker, this is a plan that above all will bring Australians back safely together. It's a plan that has been supported by Australians by going out there and getting vaccinated. 307,000 doses yesterday, 1.9 million a week, 9 million AstraZeneca doses and more which have been administered, Mr Speaker. There are more places you can get vaccinated now than there are petrol stations you can get petrol in your car, Mr Speaker. The plan is coming together.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On the day that Queensland's hotel quarantine system reaches capacity, the Morrison government asks the Parliament to agree to the construction of dedicated quarantine facilities in Queensland and Western Australia. Why has it taken a lockdown affecting half of the Australian population, at least 27 breaches in hotel quarantine and a system at breaking point for the Prime Minister to accept fit-for-purpose quarantine facilities have been needed all along?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, in framing that question in that way, Mr Speaker, I think discourages the great work that has been done by states and territories around the clock, Mr Speaker, for the last 18 months. Because when we came together in March of last year and we were faced with one of the most urgent crises of people returning to this country who will be potentially COVID infected, all of us together, states, territories and the Commonwealth agreed, Mr Speaker, the most effective way to deal with this crisis was to ensure we put in place a system of hotel quarantine, which all the states and territories signed up for, and that has had a success rate, Mr Speaker, which the rest of the world has envied. And I know that because I've discussed it, Mr Speaker, with those leaders, and those opposite may wish to pretend that any system of quarantine can operate with 100% effectiveness, Mr Speaker, but that would be foolish, that would be unrealistic, that would be seeking, Mr Speaker, just to simply undermine the efforts that have been put into place that have saved 30,000 lives and got 1 million people back to work. Mr Speaker, our national plan, Mr Speaker, is going to ensure that we can open this country up again. When we do reach those 70 and 80% vaccination rates, Mr Speaker, that we can live with the virus into the future, Mr Speaker, something that has been cast doubt upon by those opposite.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The question was about fit-for-purpose quarantine facilities that were considered by this Parliament, this House, earlier today, without the usual inquiries through the Public Works Committee, and the fact that the government brought it forward as a matter of urgency 18 months
the Leader of the
after
Opposition
what the Prime Minister just referenced.
Will resume his seat. Leader of the Opposition won't debate the matter. The Prime Minister's been relevant up until this point, but the question was about quarantine, not the broader opening up and other policies associated with the challenge that we have, but I'll call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, so in addition, as part of this broad program that we have been embarked upon over these last 18 months and the highly effective nature of the arrangements that states and territories elected to enter into, Mr Speaker, they did elect it, Mr Speaker. I was at the meeting. The Leader of the Opposition was not, Mr Speaker. He was too busy bagging the National Cabinet for existing in the first place, Mr Speaker. That's what he was doing in the first place. And, Mr Speaker, he may have had a road to Maribyrnong conversion, Mr Speaker, this day about the national plan, but I don't think anyone believes him.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-Joyce government support for sticking to the national plan will support the aviation sector, protect jobs and industry and guarantee essential services, providing a safe pathway through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to commend the question asked by the honourable member for Flynn. The honourable member for Flynn, Mr Speaker, has asked a question about services. He asked a question about services in regional areas. And he would know about services, Mr Speaker, because the honourable member for Flynn ran a hardware business, providing services and hardware. He ran a fuels business, providing fuel services to the people of his community, and he also owned O'Dowd's Irish Pub. Who would have thunk it? Who would have thunk it? Providing all sorts of services and beverages and other things to half the city of Rockhampton. So, Mr. Speaker, he also understands how important it is and how vital it is to make sure that people arrive in Rockhampton. And that is why he had to rely on a coalition government for the Domestic Aviation Network Support Scheme, the Regional Aviation Network Support Scheme, the Tourism Aviation Network Support Scheme, and he understood quite clearly that under the Domestic Aviation Network Support Scheme was support for the accreditation of people who worked at airports, also vitally important. He understood quite clearly of the $750 that was paid to people in hotspots and how that kept them in a job. And I'll tell you what, Mr. Speaker, he also understands that the Australian people want their freedoms and their liberties back, and the safe plan to do that is with the coalition as we do it as quickly as possible. The Australian people want their life back. The Australian people want to live like they did before. They want to get back to O'Dowd's Irish Pub. O'Dowd's Irish Pub, because that is part of our culture. It's part of our fabric. And I apologise for all the advertising I'm doing for O'Dowd's Irish Pub, but it's worth it. Now, through the process of these aviation packages, Mr. Speaker, we have moved nearly 2 million people. 2 million people. And that is a great sense of the efficacy of a coalition policy to deliver back to regional areas. In delivering back to regional areas and delivering services, like he would know that we have to have people who work in regional areas, and that is why a coalition agreement, and I commend the work done by the Minister for Agriculture, David Littleproud, and others we have brought forward the Ag Visa, which is also vitally important in providing the services so we get the food out of the paddock and so we can get it to Rockhampton, so we can cook it in the kitchen, so we can serve the people who go to O'Dowd's Irish Pub, because we are the people who understand regional Australia. We've run businesses, we understand businesses, we know what needs to be done. We're going to give the Australian people back their lives, back their liberties as quickly as possible, and we have the safe plan to do it.
And I call the honourable member for Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. At nearly 600 aged care centres across Australia, less than half of the workforce have had their first vaccine dose. Given the government's announced mandate for workforce vaccination starts in just over 3 weeks, can the government guarantee that there will be enough vaccinated aged care workers to care for vulnerable older Australians?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Yes is the simple answer, and the reason is that at this stage what we are seeing is a dramatic increase in aged care workers as a result of the National Cabinet decision. It was a difficult and challenging decision, and I'm pleased that all of the Premiers and Chief Ministers supported the initiative of the Prime Minister and the AHPPC to support and encourage aged care workers to take up the vaccine. And I'm actually very pleased to be able to say that that number has increased significantly, almost 5% in one day, to 76.1% of aged care workers now who have had vaccination. And that is as a result of in-reach programs and outreach programs. The programs that we've put in place include general practice visits, the state vaccine clinics, the Commonwealth vaccine clinics, the roving clinics, the in-reach clinics, and these clinics are being provided through self-vaccination, which has been a highly effective mechanism. I've mentioned before TLC and Lou Pascuzzi and his team in Victoria that have done an extraordinary job. They've created and provided a national model which is being rolled out. We have vaccination service providers which are providing those vaccines around the country, and we also have, in relation to that, the in-reach work of general practices and primary health networks that are assisting. So there are multiple pathways for those vaccinations, including indeed the fact that we've had over 670 on-site clinics organised recently by residential aged care providers themselves, as I mentioned. dedicated aged care clinics recently for 585 RACFs, residential aged care facilities. So all of these things are occurring. And the other thing that is happening at the same time, and I think this is very important and very pleasing, is there were those residents for whom consent was not given either by the resident or their families. And we've seen, even though we had visited all facilities through these programs of InReach, we've seen the number of residents increase successively from 85 to 86 to 87 to 88, now to 88.4% of residents. And many of them have had their doubts or their families had not been supportive. So all of these things.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, and I respect absolutely the importance of the information that the Health Minister is offering the House. The question's quite specifically about the aged care workforce.
Yes, well, yes, that's true, but the Minister did. The question is whether he's being relevant to the question, and I think he is being relevant to it, and whether he's answered the question. He did it in one word at the beginning of his answer, so I'll keep listening while he's on the policy topic. I think he's fine. I have, of course, sat him down before, but that was for a different reason. The Minister has the call.
Thank you for the guidance, Mr Speaker. And, but on that point, the fact that we have now reached 88.4% of residents, it is a voluntary vaccination for residents, and it is a voluntary vaccination for workers, but it is a workplace requirement if they wish to work in that situation. So what we've seen through the work of Operation COVID Shield is an extraordinary uplift. The public health orders, 6 states and territories have now implemented them, have also made a difference, and the publication of the vaccination rates, which we did consciously, has also driven action, and all of these things are coming together to protect our elderly Australians.
The time has concluded. And I now give the call to the honourable member for Kennedy.
To the Treasurer, slithering suits out of Sydney Universities contaminate trade unions, but now invest all superannuation monies, 51% of super going into stock market, what Maynard Keynes called a roulette wheel. For 70 years, 60% of super, by law, went into government securities. Respected trade union voices advocate an authority to invest 25% into government-secured make-money projects, dams, factories, mining ports. Better surely than vote-grabbing self-indulgence, ring roads and Olympic Games.
I'll just call the Treasurer. Members could stop interjecting. I'm not really. No, you can leave in a second if you want. I'm not sure what the question was, but I'll call the Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Kennedy for his question. And his question was obviously about superannuation and the investment in domestic assets, and particularly infrastructure, Mr Speaker. Now, I think the member for Kennedy was referring colloquially what was known as the 30-20 rule. It was a rule where you had superannuation, or otherwise known then as retirement schemes, that were run by life insurance companies, and they were required to invest a certain proportion of their assets in government securities. 30% of their assets were required to be invested in government securities, and 20% of that needed to be in Commonwealth securities. Now, following the Campbell inquiry, they brought to an end that process, that requirement, because they found that it was actually distortionary and it was inefficient and ineffective. What we have done as a government, as part of a broader superannuation reforms, is we are going to be requiring superannuation funds to disclose what they are investing in, the assets that they are investing in. And I share the member for Kennedy's enthusiasm for our superannuation sector, now $3 trillion strong, to invest in Australian infrastructure assets. It's really important, and our reforms will help do that. And along with those reforms, there have been broader reforms with superannuation designed to support members. And whether that is banning exit fees, whether that is capping fees on low balance accounts, whether that's consolidating inactive accounts, or more recently what we've done with respect to transparency and accountability of superannuation and giving members the ability to see the fees and the returns of their superannuation funds and to ensure there aren't duplicate accounts. So I'd say, Mr Speaker, to the honourable member for Kennedy, we are focused on ensuring that our superannuation funds are delivering the best returns for their members, because at the end of the day, the money belongs to the members. It's not the fund manager's money, it's not the union's money, it belongs to the members, and we want to see more of that money invested in Australia, including in infrastructure.
And I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House what the Morrison government is doing to support our economic recovery, and why every Australian state and territory needs to stay committed to the national plan that has been agreed to so that we can live with COVID into the future?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Bass for a question to acknowledge her strong advocacy and involvement in her local community, formerly as a councillor and indeed as a mayor and as a beef farmer, Mr Speaker, as well, over the course of her career before coming to this place. And she's a strong advocate for small business, and it was really pleasing that the Morrison government joined with the Gutwein government recently in providing support for small businesses with grants ranging from $2,000 to $10,000 in the state of Tasmania. Now, Mr Speaker, small business is doing it really tough right now, in and out of lockdown and the uncertainty that that creates. That's why we've been providing grants to small business. But today we've gone further. Today we've gone further by expanding our small and medium-sized business loan scheme. Now, Mr Speaker, this scheme has already delivered more than 70,000 loans worth more than $6 billion. And you had to have as a requirement to be eligible for that scheme that you needed to be on JobKeeper in the March quarter. We're now removing that requirement, and small and medium-sized businesses, whether they're in the tourism industry, whether in the hospitality industry, whether in the construction sector, will be able to apply for loans of up to $5 million with up to 10 years duration, with up to the first 2 years being repayment-free. And this money can be used as working capital, this money can be used to expand their business by investing in machinery and equipment, or this money can be used for refinancing. But the long-term sustainable future of small business is not with government loans or in government grants, it's actually by sticking to the plan. Sticking to the plan agreed by National Cabinet, which will see restrictions eased at 70% and 80% vaccination rates. Because we know from the Doherty Institute that zero COVID forever is unrealistic, which means we must learn to live with the virus, as we have done with influenza, Mr Speaker, which is 200,000 cases a year here in Australia and 600 deaths. And so we're seeking to learn to live with the virus. And our support for small business is based on the fact that we believe how integral they are to our community and to our economy, and when we ease the restrictions, we can start to see them reopen and get their customers back. And I say to the House, and I say to the honourable member, if we don't ease restrictions at 70% and 80%, when do we? When do we see our kids go back to school? When do we see businesses reopen? When can we join with loved ones at funerals or at weddings? And when can we travel more freely across our own country? We need to give people hope, and the plan led by the Prime Minister and agreed at National Cabinet gives that hope.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 8 days into the Sydney outbreak, the Prime Minister congratulated the New South Wales Premier for not locking down. 2 months later, the whole of New South Wales is in extended lockdown, and a record 919 new cases today, and the outbreak has spread to Victoria, the ACT and even New Zealand. New South Wales hospitals are at breaking point. Will the Prime Minister accept his complacency contributed to the current circumstances?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 23rd of August, the Leader of the Opposition was opposing the national plan. He pretends today he was supporting it. Now, Mr. Speaker,
I'll just say to the Prime Minister that the question wasn't about the national plan. Prime Minister has the call. It needs to be Manager of Opposition Business will cease interjecting, as will the member for Franklin. The Prime Minister needs to be relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in New South Wales is of course, intensely serious. It is incredibly serious, Mr. Speaker. And that situation, Mr. Speaker, is a function of one thing: the Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus, Mr. Speaker. Those opposite might like to think that Australia is somehow immune to a global pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps they think that the fault of there being a lockdown in New Zealand is the fault of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, or the outbreak in the United Kingdom or in the Netherlands, Mr. Speaker, or other parts of the world, Mr. Speaker, is the function of those leaders, Mr. Speaker. But what sensible people understand, Mr. Speaker, is that what we are going through is a global pandemic. And in this country, Mr. Speaker, country, Mr. Speaker, the actions of the government, together with governments around the country, has saved 30,000 lives, and 1 million people, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, are back in work. And what I note this year, Mr. Speaker, because I remember last year very vividly, when Melbourne, Mr. Speaker, was going through the lockdown.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. It was a specific question about whether the Prime Minister accepted any responsibility.
The point of order is on relevance, I presume.
Well, do you understand?
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the House will cease their conversation. The point of order is on relevance, I take it.
Is on relevance, Mr. Speaker. The question went to whether there was any responsibility for the fact that the Prime Minister encouraged and congratulated the New South Wales Premier for not taking action
to the Leader of the Opposition,
against the pandemic.
He doesn't need to restate the question. No, he doesn't need to restate it. That's the last thing he needs to do. When the Leader of the Opposition says it was a very specific question, it was a very specific question at the end of a very long preamble. That doesn't open the question up entirely, but I'm listening to the Prime Minister to ensure he's being relevant to the question. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, all premiers, all chief ministers, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, others, have had to make many decisions over the course of this pandemic. And collectively, those decisions, Mr. Speaker, have saved 30,000 lives in this country, something envied by countries all around the world. And we have an economy, Mr. Speaker, that remains incredibly resilient, and 1 million people, Mr. Speaker, coming back into work after the COVID-19 recession last year. Those are the decisions that governments have been taking, and they are the results that are being achieved. Now, the Delta variant, as we know, completely changed everything in terms of our COVID response. And, Mr. Speaker, the New South Wales government made decisions, Mr. Speaker, and have been making decisions over the course of this pandemic, and on previous occasions they have made decisions where they haven't locked down, which enable children to still go to school, Mr. Speaker, where enable businesses to remain open and avoid the great hardship of the lockdowns, which cause terrible ruin on people, Mr. Speaker. These lockdowns are hard to endure. They are necessary at this time, Mr. Speaker, but only as long as they need to be. And the New South Wales government has sought to avoid those lockdowns, Mr. Speaker, over the course of this pandemic. Mr. Speaker. Now, those opposite may want to charge in and attack the New South Wales government for their efforts. They may seek to do that, Mr. Speaker. I am not going to do that. What I know is last year, Mr. Speaker, over 800 lives were lost in Victoria. This year in New South Wales, 76 have been lost. We are making great progress in fighting this pandemic, and I thank all the premiers for their.
I now give the call to the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on the COVID-19 vaccine rollout and how sticking to the national plan will provide both hope and safety for Australians?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Lindsay for her support and advocacy for her community in a challenging time. Last night I had the privilege of representing Australia at an online meeting of APEC health ministers. The Canadian convener made the point that 64,000 people had been lost in the last week on official figures. We were aware that 4.5 million people in a global pandemic, as the Prime Minister has said, have lost their lives on official figures, probably closer to 10 million on the advice of the World Health Organization. Every country who spoke last night had hardship, had challenges. The New Zealand Minister, Andrew Little, gave a very impassioned, powerful speech about a nation in full lockdown right now, New Zealand, which has done so well. We are so proud of our Kiwi cousins and of what they've done. But right now they are in a full national lockdown. And their challenge... Don't do it, Anthony. Don't do it.
The Minister for Health will just answer the question. The Minister for Health will answer the question.
Right now, New Zealand faces its own lockdown as part of a global pandemic. And the message which all shared, though, was that through this we need hope and safety. These are the paths to recovery. These two things are the way forward. And so in that context, what we see over the last 24 hours, 307,000 vaccinations, 43,000 higher than on the same day last week, a 15% increase in 1 week on that day's results. 6.5 million vaccinations over 30 days. That is the population of Melbourne and Adelaide and Townsville together over 30 days. Almost 5 times the population of Adelaide being vaccinated in that period of time. That's what Australians are doing, and that's what does give us hope. And yes, the national plan does set some challenging targets. Some would say it's too conservative. 70% and 80% are real milestones that will provide significant protection and safety and fundamentally change the equation. And these vaccinations are bringing us closer to those marks every day. And so I say to Australians, thank you for coming forward. But to those who have not taken the opportunity, please do so. And to those who become eligible, this is your chance and your time and your capacity to help protect every Australian.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Sydney's health system is under real pressure. At Westmead Hospital in Sydney, 2/3 of intensive care beds are occupied by COVID-positive patients, and patients are being sent to other hospitals to free up space. Ramping of ambulances with patients have been waiting to get into Westmead and Nepean hospitals. Now, what extra resources will the federal government allocate to New South Wales to ensure its health system is not overwhelmed?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, and I'll ask the Minister for Health, you may wish to add to this answer. Over the course of this pandemic, the federal government has committed and provided some $27 billion in direct health support right across this country to support the very types of measures and challenges that the member refers to, Mr Speaker. We entered in right from the start, a 50-50 dollar-for-dollar arrangement to support the costs that were being borne by states and territories because of the additional COVID-related pressures that they are facing in providing COVID-related medical support through their hospital systems. Now, that is not the normal deal. The normal deal is 45-55, 55 done by the states, Mr Speaker. A long-standing arrangement, Mr Speaker. We made that dollar for dollar because we knew we would have to walk each step of the way with the states and territories when it came to backing them in on the medical and health support that they would need to provide during this pandemic. And I send out a big shout-out to all of those nurses, to all of those doctors, to all of those paramedics, Mr Speaker, and ambulance workers. I know a bit about that. My brother's one of them. And, Mr Speaker, they're doing an amazing job. under great sacrifice and under intense pressure, often prevented from being with their families because of the nature of the work that they're doing. And, Mr Speaker, we are backing them in because we've been backing them in each and every day of this pandemic. And not just the health workers, Mr Speaker, not just the hospitals, but we've been backing in the men and women who are unable to get work during the course of this pandemic, and some $4 billion worth of COVID disaster payments being made even now in the course of these most recent lockdowns to provide them with the help and the support that they need. Every single week, Mr Speaker, as we have done now for many, many months, every single week the Department of Health, led by the Secretary, Professor Murphy, does a full assessment of the pressures working with the states and territories across the public health systems of all the states and territories. And that report is provided to the National Cabinet at our most recent meeting. It was a topic of real discussion, as it should be. And, Mr Speaker, as we discussed the various contingencies we would have to put in place with movement of workforces, one of the most inspiring things I've seen over the course of this last 18 months, as we've worked together as a team of Premiers, Chief Ministers and myself, Mr Speaker, is to ensure that we respond to each other's needs. And so you've got Western Australia contact tracers working on the outbreak in New South Wales, Mr Speaker. You've got the same from Tasmania supporting other states, just as New South Wales were supporting other states when they were in difficulty with their world-class systems. So, Mr Speaker, there isn't time for the Health Minister to add, but the government, Mr Speaker, is standing with the states and territories to help them address this very real burden, but we must proceed with the plan.
Concluded. And I give the call to the honourable member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I asked the Defence Minister if he can outline to the House how the men and women of the Australian Defence Force are continuing to bring back Australians and Australian visa holders from Afghanistan.
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I thank him too for his time as Defence Minister and his contribution to supporting our Australian Defence Force personnel, which has been a long-term pursuit of his, and it's a great credit to him. Mr Speaker, all Australians should be incredibly proud of the work that is being done in Kabul at the moment by Australian Defence Force personnel. They're joined, of course, by DFAT and by Home Affairs staff and people from other agencies. And I also want to pay tribute and say thank you most sincerely to the United Kingdom and to the United States, to New Zealand, to our partners otherwise, who are working seamlessly to get our nationals off the ground and also to provide support to uplift those Afghan nationals and people who are deserving of our support, and there are many, many in that category, Mr Speaker. The work of the Australian Defence Force, of course, has continued on over a long period of time, and we have looked at the situation. There has been a surge of activity since April in particular of this year, but over the last 8 years, Australians would be interested to know that we have issued visas to 8,500 Afghan nationals and provided support to those people to resettle in our country. We have provided support to the interpreters and to those that have helped us over the course of the campaign in Afghanistan, and in particular since April we've been bringing people on regular commercial flights at that time, most days, to resettle in Australia, and that has been a great credit to the staff at the Australian Defence Force, but also to Home Affairs and to the other agencies. Mr Speaker, I want to recognise the work of the Royal Australian Air Force, one of the most recognised, capable forces in the world. They have been exceptional in their work in this, their 100th year of service to our country in Kabul. We've had 5 flights overnight. The KC-30, the mid-air refueller, is providing support to our allied partners, and that is an invaluable asset and a great credit to the men and women of the Royal Australian Air Force. I want to pay tribute also, Mr Speaker, to the officers within the Special Forces, the Commandos, the SAS, an incredible asset for our country. Those men and women who serve in the SAS and their family members should be incredibly proud now more than ever of the work that they are doing in Afghanistan. So we have lifted, Mr Speaker, now 2,650 people since Wednesday alone. This includes, as the Prime Minister pointed out earlier, 955 people on those 5 flights in the last 24 hours. There is more work to be done, but of course we know that the security threats on the ground continue to increase, we take the advice of the CDF as to how long it is possible for us to stay in country to keep our own people safe and to help those that have helped us.
And I'll give the call to the member for Chifley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Mount Druitt, at the heart of the Chifley electorate, has been smashed by COVID. Nearly 2 weeks ago, Labor wrote to the Prime Minister urging him to utilise the ADF to set up and run vaccination hubs in Western Sydney. The government said this is unnecessary. Why won't the government do everything it can to get vulnerable people in my electorate and in Western Sydney vaccinated?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and to the member for Chifley. The presumption in the question is incorrect. We have 777 Commonwealth vaccination sites across Western Sydney. There are 12 LGAs in particular that covers. We have over 2,500 Commonwealth vaccination sites across New South Wales. In particular, I can say that, for example, in regards to Blacktown, I know that there are 192 sites within 10 kilometres of the middle of Blacktown. In relation to Fairfield, I know that there are 300 sites within 10 kilometres of Fairfield. These are being run by GPs, by pharmacists and Commonwealth vaccination clinics, and these are fundamentally critical sites. There is no impediment to any site ordering more AstraZeneca. They have uncapped allocations, and so these sites are already available. 777 Commonwealth vaccination sites operating across Western Sydney as we speak. And I want to thank those people who are doing an extraordinary job. And we think that the way they are operating is saving lives and protecting lives. They have been progressively expanding in number, and what we're seeing now is that this has helped New South Wales achieve globally leading vaccination rates over the last month. We've seen that. Casey Briggs, I'll give him a shout-out from the ABC. Nobody would accuse him of being anything other than robustly independent, has been doing the analysis, has identified the fact that Australia has been able to vaccinate at rates faster than at any time in the UK over a 7-day period, and now the US. But the New South Wales has been even faster than the nation as a whole, and it's these 777 sites across Western Sydney which have been at the heart of delivering those outcomes. So I respectfully but categorically disagree with the presumption of the question.
And I call the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government continues to resettle Afghan nationals in response to the serious situation in Afghanistan and is working in the national interest to keep Australians safe as well?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for her question. And there have now been some very successful flights from Kabul, particularly overnight. We have now helped around about 2,650 people to be evacuated from Kabul since this operation commenced on the 18th of August, and that includes some 955 that were evacuated overnight on 5 flights. Now, that's extraordinary. It is an absolutely outstanding effort on behalf of those who have been there, working in many cases around the clock to support Australians, permanent residents and visa holders to be able to evacuate, come out of Kabul. Now, we have already brought 3 plane loads of those evacuees through to Australia. Those flights have landed in Perth, Melbourne and Adelaide. So those people are already in their mandatory 14-day quarantine. So they're undergoing exactly the same process as anyone else who comes into this country and undertaking 14 days of quarantine. After that, we will be looking to resettle these people into the community as soon as we possibly can. So every effort is being taken to make sure that we are keeping Australians safe and secure by bringing these people into the country, putting them through hotel quarantine and then moving them to resettle within our community. Now, our people on the ground in Kabul are working around the clock and they are supported by people right here in Australia. We understand how extreme the situation is in Kabul and it is deteriorating hour by hour. But we are still there and we are continuing to do all that we can to make sure that we are able to evacuate as many people as we possibly can. We're making sure that we're conducting the checks that are needed to support these people as they are flown out of Kabul to safety. And I think it's important for Australians to be reminded that it is our diligence that has been demonstrated over many, many years when it comes to our national security that should give them the confidence to know that we can be opening and welcoming of people from all nations. We do have a very rich tapestry here in Australia. A number of cultures have been here. Many cultures, in fact, have made Australia home, and it makes us who we are. And we can certainly be very proud, all of us here and all of us right across Australia, of the role that we play in the international community. So we continue to work with the Afghan community here in Australia. We will look at how many people we can bring as soon as we possibly can under our humanitarian program to support those people to settle safely here in Australia.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Lakemba Respiratory Clinic is run by the federal government. It's one of the sites the Minister referred to in his last answer. The manager of the clinic, Dr Saleh, says he's been forced to borrow vaccines from nearby clinics because his weekly delivery didn't show up. Dr Saleh says, I don't know which day doses will arrive. Last week it was Monday. This week we've been told Thursday. Why is this happening in a COVID hotspot?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd be pleased to receive the details because we have a vaccine operations centre which ensures that each week we are achieving full national distribution. There are 8,000 sites. Those are being delivered on a weekly basis. The advice that I have is that they are being achieved. If there are any issues in relation to this particular site, this has not been drawn to my attention. This is one of the issues which we do manage on behalf of many members in this House, and we've been able to resolve them as and when they arise. I'm not aware that the member has previously made any representations to myself or Operation COVID Shield on this. It doesn't sound like it.
No, hang on. Just say to the Minister for Health. Yes, the Manager of Opposition Business. I'm going to deal with the matter first. No, the Manager of Opposition Business will just resume his seat for a second. Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. And I say to the Minister for Health, the way question time works is the ministers get the questions. I discourage interjections. You cannot adopt a practice where you ask a question and expect them to answer. Otherwise, and this has happened a couple of times, not just with the Minister for Health, if that is going to be the practice, one, I'll stop it, and I might stop it by allowing an indulgence on the matter from the target of that, the Minister for Health.
So I would be very pleased to receive any information in relation to this particular facility, and I would be happy to provide the details of the provision of vaccines. There is no doubt that every facility is receiving vaccines around the country, as I say, over 8,000 Commonwealth facilities, as well as providing support for over 800 state facilities. And if there is any particular evidence and material, we would be pleased to respond to that immediately, as we have done with other members who have made representations. I would also note there is one element which may affect distribution over the coming days. There is the risk of a transport strike on Friday, and
The member for Whitlam will cease interjecting.
And we hope
the Minister for
that
Health.
There is no impact on distribution, because an impact on one part of the system does have an impact on another part of the system. We'll continue to provide the vaccines, and I would be pleased to receive the advice and the material, and we'll address it immediately.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workplace, Skills, Small and Family Business, who is my new neighbour up here. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is providing critical support for small businesses through the pandemic, and why sticking to the national plan is so important to the recovery? I've asked the wrong question. My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Would he please update the House on how the Morrison government is sticking to the national plan and supporting students?
You can't. You've asked the question. I'm going to call the Minister for Small Business. And
well, thank you, Mr Speaker.
Yes, it's probably the clearest illustration that it's not a question without notice. But anyway, maybe it is. Maybe it is. The Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for his question and for all the support he provides to the small and family businesses in his electorate. We have seen, not just in lockdowns right across the country, but of course in the member's electorate over time as well, that many small businesses are doing it very, very tough. Whether it's previously in the member's electorate, if it's in members' electorates in New South Wales and Victoria, or indeed if it's on the Gold Coast in my electorate, where not locked down but 80% of all trade comes from interstate, or indeed for those small business operators who, as at this morning, are now locked out of the state of Queensland, they're doing it tough. It's one of the reasons why the Morrison government has put in place the largest set of support for small business, frankly, in our nation's history, $291 billion in direct economic support. And not just through last year's JobKeeper, our boosting the cash flow measures, our small and medium enterprise guarantee schemes. Of course, we extended the instant asset write-off. We extended and accelerated income support, early release of superannuation. We've also reduced the company tax rate from 30 to 25%. We've ensured the ATO can no longer pursue recovery action whilst matters are before the AAT, and of course we're ensuring that vital cash flow line for small business that they're paid within 20 days from large business and government, because we know that is so important. But we also know, as we fight towards 70 and 80% vaccination rates, that becomes the opportunity for us, as per the national plan, for small businesses to be open, for trading to continue and to grow. And that's why the national plan is so central to what we need for the economic lifeline of our small businesses. Furthermore, we've seen the business support payments currently flowing in New South Wales, with payments between $1,500 and $100,000 per week, based on the level of payroll, with the maximum turnover thresholds up to $250 million, and of course up to $1,000 a week for sole traders. And further payments have been done in conjunction with every other state and territory across the country. And today again the Treasurer has announced further support for the small to medium enterprise sector, with the expansion of eligibility for the SME Recovery Loan Scheme. So as of today, that scheme, the loans are extended to even more SMEs. As the Treasurer said this morning, we've seen $6.2 billion of assistance on 74,000 loans, and now with changing the criteria, we will see more and more businesses eligible. Now, this will buy us some time, but importantly, the best path back is sticking to the COVID national plan. The 70% and 80%, that gives certainty, and only certainty will build confidence for the small to business or small to medium enterprise sector of the economy to grow.
Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry. I refer to the report in The Australian that the Morrison-Joyce government told CSL it would support mRNA manufacturing provided it meets the ABV test anywhere but Victoria. Is the report true?
The Minister for Industry has the call.
The short answer is it's not, and obviously I was as concerned as the member was when I read that article. Now, whether or not such a claim was made by any person to the journalist, I obviously can't say or verify, but my office and the department went to some lengths to speak directly with those people at CSL who would be in knowledge of any such statement if it were ever made, because it is a matter of some seriousness if a Commonwealth official were to say such a thing, which they would never do and which we would never expect them to do. That would be a totally improper and wrong thing to do. So what I can say to the member is that that report about Commonwealth officials advising CSL that the government had an ABV test is absolutely wrong, has been verified directly after specific inquiries by my office to my office that it's wrong. What we are doing with respect to our approach to market is looking at all of the options that are in Australia's long-term best interests in terms of healthcare for mRNA manufactured vaccines, potentially here, for COVID booster vaccines, for other therapeutics, for export markets. CSL has had a brilliant and rich history in Australia in contributing, and indeed is manufacturing vaccines in Australia as we speak, and they have done a marvellous job. They've put in an excellent proposal, if I might say so. It's being considered seriously alongside all of the other proposals, so I'm very pleased to say to the member that whether that was ever said to the journalist, I can't say, but that was never said by any Commonwealth official to anyone at CSL, and nor would it ever be.
I now give the call to the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister please update the House how the Morrison government is sticking to the national plan and supporting students across Australia?
The Minister for Education and Youth.
Can I thank the member for Robertson for her question? And she's a teacher herself, I think the daughter of a school principal, and I know that she, like the member for Grey, knows that the national plan is important not just to open our economy and our society, but it's so important for our young people also, because, Mr Speaker, when we reach those 70 to 80% vaccination rates, the national plan says that only low-level restrictions are required, and that means that we can now open the schools, the sporting grounds and those other things as well, absence of those hotspots being present. Mr Speaker, this is so important for our kids and parents to give them that confidence and the hope that we can get back to normal life like we used to have 18 months ago. And Mr Speaker, as everybody in this chamber knows, our young people, they've just missed so much in the last 18 months, and particularly so in my home city of Melbourne. It's not just the face-to-face learning that they've missed, but it's the school formals, the graduations, the camps which they so much look forward to, the trips away, the local sport. I could go on. And these are just the normal part of being a kid and of going to school. And they've had to endure those sacrifices over all that time. And, Mr Speaker, we know the mental health impacts of all of this have just been devastating. I mean, Professor Patrick McGorry refers to it as the shadow pandemic, such is the extent of it. Now, this national plan, Mr Speaker, is so important to give that hope and confidence to be able to address those things, to get back to normal for those kids. And we are so close to achieving those milestones that are outlined in that national plan. Mr Speaker, I've got enormous confidence and pride in our young people. The NAPLAN results released today just show how resilient they have been, at least in their learning, because it shows that the results from May of this year, when the tests were held, are actually the same as what they were 2 years ago. So no loss of learning had occurred, despite the fact that in some cases almost 6 months of face-to-face schooling had been lost. And it's such a testament to their resilience, but also a testament to the parents' resilience and to the teachers' expertise as well, to be able to adapt and ensure those kids continue to learn. Mr Speaker, our government here, we are backing our students 100%. We back them with the hope through this plan. We back them with record funding in schools. We're backing them with extra funding that we're putting into mental health that they can access. And importantly, Mr Speaker, we're backing them with the hope and opportunities of what they can do post-school as well, with record youth unemployment, more university opportunities than ever before, and many more training opportunities than ever before as well.
Concluded. And I give the call to the member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The New South Wales Chief Health Officer says during this outbreak we've seen more children infected, more childcare centre outbreaks and children contributing to transmission. Does the government have enough vaccines for all 12 to 15-year-olds to begin as soon as ATAGI recommends?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We received some interim advice from ATAGI last Friday, and that was a key issue discussed at the meeting of Premiers, Chief Ministers and myself. This Friday we'll be presented with the plan from General Fruin, which will follow through on our agreement last week that we need to move as soon as possible and have completed before the end of terms this year, Mr Speaker, to ensure that they are vaccinated. And the short answer, Mr Speaker, is that the vaccine supply continues to increase week by week by week, and we will, Mr Speaker, be able to vaccinate those aged between 12 and 15 alongside the rest of the population in the weeks and months ahead. And that is exactly what we're planning to do. I know this is very important. My own daughter's 12, Mr Speaker. I actually had this conversation with her today, that they'll be looking forward to going forward and getting their vaccines as soon as that can be arranged. And there is a big job to do with the vaccine program across the whole country, and the advice that we have received from Doherty, the Doherty Institute, which I remind people, I mean, we all know how magnificent the Doherty Institute is here, but I remind those who may be watching on, this is the institute that was the first to reproduce in a lab the COVID-19 virus and share it with the rest of the world. This is not just any scientific institute. This is one of the world's leading institutes when it comes to these issues. And their advice has been also very clear that we must continue to maintain the pace of the vaccination across the rest of the adult population. And one of the best protections there is for children, and not just those aged between 12 to 15, as the member would know, given his medical experience, but those under 12 for whom there is not a vaccine, the best protection for them is the broader immunisation of the community, and particularly those in the parent age groups. So we will continue to put priorities across all of those fronts. Already, as the Health Minister I'm sure would be able to tell you, that we are already vaccinating those aged 12 to 15 who have particular other conditions, those who are Indigenous, those who are living in remote areas. That decision was taken some time ago, and to ensure that we can move on that, we have been looking carefully at what the outcomes have been of the vaccination of 12 to 15s in other parts of the world, and that's why we await that advice. But the interim advice was very favourable, but I'm sure every parent of children in that age group would want to know, just like when they're getting their normal immunisations at any other time, that our appropriate regulatory authorities have given it the tick, and the doses, as we continue to see, including those extra 1 million doses we were able to get out of Poland, Mr Speaker, adding to the great vaccination effort, which is hitting marks in this country over a 7-day period that exceeds that even achieved at the height of the US and the UK's vaccination programs.
And I call the member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister please update the House on how sticking to the national plan will support Australia's tourism sector and ready it for when it opens back up?
The Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for asking the right question. Can I also... Can I also thank the member for his passionate advocacy on behalf of the tourism industry in far north Queensland. And I know there's no one more than the member who will be waiting for southerners to be able to return to those crocodile farms in far north Queensland in their droves and put dollars into the local economy, local accommodation and into the local pubs. And I know he was very grateful when the Queensland State Government and the federal government were able to come together and provide a package of $600 million to support businesses in Queensland, including tourism businesses in far north Queensland. And with the announcement today made by the Treasurer about the additional changes to the small loans guarantees for small businesses, which will also help the tourism sector right across Australia. Mr Speaker, I think there's no doubt that the national plan will be greeted by the tourism industry, probably more so than any other industry across this nation, because the impact that this pandemic has had on the domestic tourism industry and on our international tourism industry has been severe. And the fact that we now have a national plan which details a way out of this pandemic, which lays out how we can learn to live with this virus, has been extremely welcomed by the tourism industry. And why is that so? Because when we get to phase B, which is 70% vaccination rate, Australians will have more freedom to see their loved ones and go to sporting events. And that means travel, and that means dollars in the businesses, the tourism businesses, and it means jobs. And then when we get to phase C, when we see 80% are fully vaccinated, outbound international restrictions will be lifted and travel bubbles will be expanded. So not only will we have the travel bubble with New Zealand, but the Pacific Islands, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, the US, the UK are all possibilities that we'll be able to extend our travel bubbles to. And what does that mean? It means dollars into tourism businesses, and more importantly, it means security for the 660,000 people who are employed in our tourism industry. This is why the tourism industry has got behind promoting our vaccination rollout. We've all seen the Qantas ad, which in many occasions has brought a tear to this eye, and that is why we need to back the national plan.
Concluded. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister, and it refers to the first question that was asked in question time today by the member for Solomon, where the Prime Minister failed to verify whether a report was true or not. According to that report, Afghans with valid Australian visas who protected the Australian Embassy and their families, up to 1,200 people, were left to wait outside Kabul airport, some standing in sewage, before being turned away. The Prime Minister must know whether that report is true. Will he tell the Australian people, is that report true?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm not about to go into operational reports, Mr Speaker, of situations occurring on the ground in Kabul, many of which, Mr Speaker, are very difficult to confirm. Very difficult to confirm. Those opposite who may have spent time in the National Security Committee when they're in government, Mr Speaker, will know that there are many reports that come from the field, that can't be verified, and to seek to provide some confirmation of those, Mr Speaker, when that's not available, would be unwise. It would be extremely unwise. What I sought to do in answering the member's question was point out very clearly that Australians are doing everything within their power right now to bring vulnerable people out of one of the most dangerous situations in the world. And the fact that almost 2,500 have been brought out in the spaces of a week at great risk to themselves, acting under extreme stress, Mr Speaker, and doing that each and every day. 5 flights last night, Mr Speaker, almost 1,000 people out on those 5 flights. And that included operations we were able to undertake which saw additional people brought to the airport and that have been able to get on planes, I should say, Mr Speaker, is a great credit to that operation and how it is being led, both by the Australian Defence Force, but ultimately under the leadership of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I want to single out, Mr Speaker, not only those who are with me in this chamber, the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Defence, Mr Speaker, for their incredible work in leading this initiative, but also the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Mr Speaker, the Minister for Foreign Affairs has done an extraordinary job in coordinating so many of these activities. And each day the National Security Committee, which I chair, Mr Speaker, has been going over the details of these operations on a daily basis to ensure we're not only keeping our own people safe, but we're connecting up with the other partners and allies that we're working with. There are Brits, Mr Speaker, Kiwis and others getting on our planes, Afghans who have worked with them and worked with us getting on their planes and our planes. We are working together to get this job done in one of the most extreme situations you can imagine.
On my left.
Now, I note the interjection from those opposite, Mr Speaker, and I simply say this. I would invite them to support this mission and affirm the great work that is being done by our people to get people out of there safely.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources and Water. Minister, will you update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is creating jobs in regional communities by undertaking reforms to remove regulation duplication? Is the minister aware of any alternatives?
The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for Dawson. Now, we know the member for Dawson wasn't born in a crossfire hurricane, but he's got a touch of the cyclone, Mr Speaker. And when it comes to creating jobs in the member for Dawson's electorate, we know it's all right now because it's a gas, Mr Speaker. We are delivering a gas-led recovery, strategic basin plans, more opportunities for jobs, and around the members' electorate, Mr Speaker, we know that when we deliver, and as we are progressing, Mr Speaker, at the North Bowen and the Galilee basins, the potential for those gas basins to land a gas pipeline into Mackay that drives jobs is incredibly important. Now, there are restrictions, Mr Speaker. We are trying to ensure that we are streamlining regulations as part of our deregulation agenda. We are looking to ensure, particularly around the EPBC, that there is not duplication. Why should you have to have what is effectively the same level of approval at all different levels of government? So we're working closely to get that done. We are working closely and I absolutely acknowledge the work of the Minister for the Environment in terms of driving this forward, Mr Speaker. But what we know is there are challenges in this space. Now, Mr Speaker, it's only this week, in fact. It is only this week. The opposition, the Leader of the Opposition, seems to want to have a bob each way. We've seen media reports that they've had to have another vote in caucus about our supporting us for the Beetaloo Basin in terms of our strategic plan and the funding we're provided to bring forward those 6,000 jobs, up to 6,000, to bring forward that investment. And what do we see, Mr Speaker? We see them send out someone from the other place, the Labor Northern Territory Senator, to say, actually, we don't like it and we don't support it. So they need to make a determination. And I'd say to the Leader of the Opposition, plenty of opportunities for a personal explanation, to rule out this. And at the last election, support for the EDO—
The minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I refer to your earlier ruling just about 15 minutes ago about members of the government standing at the equivalent of the dispatch box and asking questions of the opposition.
I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, I chose my words carefully. I said I may well, but the minister will not ask questions of the opposition, and I'm giving fair warning now. If that happens, I will take action. It may well be I grant an indulgence, or it may well be that's the end of your contribution.
Speaker.
Yes.
Mr Speaker, those opposite in terms of alternative policies at the last election committed what they call a landmark $14 million to the Environmental Defenders Office. Now, this is an organisation who is currently charging down what we are trying to do in the Beetaloo. And, Mr Speaker, we want to ensure that there is consistency in policy. We want confidence for the industry to invest. We want to ensure that what we are doing actually happens. Now, Mr Speaker, what we know is that the resources sector has delivered 279,000 direct jobs. 279,000. We want those projects to come forward early. We want that investment to be early.
I just say to the minister, I've been listening to him and trying to ensure that he's being relevant to the question. On my notes of the question was about reducing the duplication of regulations, and he was asked whether there were alternatives. So the alternatives are to that. So he needs to be relevant to the question that he's been asked. Just because the question says, are there any alternatives, the alternatives don't stretch to every alternative anyone can ever think of on any topic. there or otherwise. So let me be very clear. He can discuss alternatives to the duplication of regulations, but not give us a description of his belief of other policies. The Minister has the call.
Yes, Mr Speaker. We will ensure you get satisfaction. And, Mr Speaker, we want to make sure that when we deregulate, that we can bring forward these projects that create jobs into regional areas, just like the member for Dawson's electorate, Mr Speaker. We know that the Australian people understand. They can't always get what they want, but the coalition government will get them what they need. And in that case, Mr Speaker, it is about jobs and job creation. It is about the deregulation agenda to ensure that we can get these projects up earlier, whether it's in the member for Dawson's electorate, the member for Flynn's electorate or right across the country, and we're committed to do just that.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper and can pleasingly announce that Australia has got their first gold medal at the Paralympics. Mr Speaker, Paige Greco and the women's C won 3,000 metres individual pursuit, and that was quickly followed by a second gold by Emily Pericola, who won the women's C4 3000 individual pursuit. Congratulations. We know there'll be many more, Mr Speaker, and we wish them all the best. I'm sure the Leader of the Opposition joins me.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Speaker, I join with the Prime Minister in congratulating our gold medal Paralympians. They do us proud as a nation and they inspire us through their efforts.
And the Minister for Health had indicated he wished to add to an answer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In relation to a question from the member for Watson, I've sought advice from the Vaccine Operations Centre with regards to the Lakemba Respiratory Clinic. The advice from the Vaccine Operations Centre is that all orders for that centre have been received on time or early. No orders have been delayed. There is one case of which they are aware where there was a request to bring forward for that same day the due delivery from the next day, but given that the day was already underway, that was not possible. But every order has been delivered on time or early. I'm also further advised by my office that we have not received any representation from the member for Watson on this issue.
The Leader of the House with papers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
I thank the Leader of the House. And if members leaving the chamber could do so now, I'll move to the matter of public importance in a second.